So, as Ellen was referring to, as I was trying to get here this morning, the regional train was cancelled. So that caused a slight change of plans. So anyways, this will be a fairly short presentation, and it will be completely without pictures, so you have to pay attention here. I've done many of these before, and this time I decided I will actually reuse some of the old material, because I think that the overlap between what I'm talking about today and what I did approximately a year ago is rather large, but to some extent the conclusions have changed, and that's sort of interesting. So to start somewhere, in the beginning of everything DNS was simple, and you had your name server, and that was basically it. The name server was certainly not the problem. The name server was rather the solution, and that was fine. Over time, however, things got more complicated, and the good guys started figuring out ways of making DNS more complicated, in the belief that they were actually solving problems, but perhaps they were just adding complexity to the system for various good reasons. So, sort of, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Every micro step has justification, but the overall system complexity that we got from this is a bit of a concern. And we also started to see bad things happen. So the problem here is that when we move from DNS as the solution to DNS as the problem, what really is the problem? And the problem here is that we're spending more and more time on DNS, and there's more and more complexity in DNS, and it soaks up more and more resources, while at the same time there is no matching revenue that can sort of balance this, and that makes it into a problem. So we have a whole bunch of changes here that are sort of propagating through the infrastructure. We have Anycast basically everywhere. We have DDoS attacks against DNS infrastructure more or less daily. We have massive changes in the technical infrastructure and how configuration management is being done, etc. We have rather how should I put it? Rather dubious changes in how we actually look at the DNS equation, as in the equation being, what should I get back if I send this query tuple in? And there is an original definition of what is DNS, and that definition is that the response to this query tuple, which is a name you query for, a type you query for, and a class you query for, should be a function of the zone contents where the answer is found. But over time, we are seeing more and more, let's call it behavior modifying stuff, where the response is a function of more parameters like that, be it where the query is coming from, or the phase of the moon and the load on that box, etc. So things are being modified in flight, and that has, well, in spite of all the goodness it brings, because people believe they want this, it certainly adds to the complexity. So we have more and more dynamic configurations, and we have more and more API-based stuff. So what's that then? Well, today when you buy DNS service, typically you talk to the DNS service provider through an API, and the API is about how you provision zones, add this zone, remove that zone, what is the current status of these 500,000 zones, give me the details of that, and what is the current SOA serials on all the servers around the planet, etc. And all these things need to be communicated, but you cannot communicate them over DNS protocols. We need other protocols, and that's where we get all the APIs. The problem with the APIs is that they are not at all standardized. So this is moving straight from open standard process-based stuff that is always interoperable into more or less proprietary stuff that is, well, it's interoperable, but it's still not open. So this adds to the picture also. I already mentioned this. We have behavior modifying things in there now that changes the response to the DNS equation. But if we turn this around and we look at the market side of this, what is happening there? Well, we have one massive change which is occurring more or less as we speak, and that is that the cost of anycast service is really hitting rock bottom. And what does that mean? Well, let me tell you that from a Netnod point of view, it's not necessarily a good thing, because we sort of try to make some revenue on selling that stuff. So the prices going down to the floor is certainly a bit of a concern. But at the same time, you have to sort of look at this from the outside and realize that market forces are market forces, and you can sort of complain about it, but they will still rule in the end, and you just have to adjust to that. So what is the consequence? The consequence is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to make a business case running DNS stuff unless you have a huge volume and you have global scale. You just cannot do this with profit in a regional context. Running 3 servers in a colo somewhere, or running 3 servers in 3 different colos, it's a loss operation. So what will the consequence be? Well, it's sort of interesting that when things change, they have a tendency of changing slowly at first. So at first, change is always gradual, and then you reach some sort of threshold or tipping point. And when you reach the tipping point, suddenly it changes for everyone. And we have a long list in history of stuff that changed gradually in the beginning, and then you reach the tipping point, and wow, it completely changes the industry, or it completely changes society, or whatever it is that is subject to change here. And the question now is, at which point will we reach this tipping point when it comes to DNS? The tipping point where the community at large, and that's both me, myself, and my cat running my own name server. I will probably keep doing that, but I'm sure that my cat will outsource his. But it's also about the smaller DNS registrars and web hosting providers and all these people and all these companies that do DNS as sort of one corner of their business, but their revenue source is not the DNS stuff. The revenue source is the other stuff. And at some point, it will be cheaper for them to just outsource the entire thing, and they will just buy this from a provider. I would be happy if it's Netnod, but there are other providers. So the point is not Netnod here. The point is that this tipping point will change the industry. And I think we're very close to that point. So what happens then? Is this good? Well, to some extent, it's good. I mean, it will be the market will become more professional, as people like to say, and that sounds good. We're changing the problem statement in some ways. It will be less of that name server is broken, and we need to upgrade Linux here and new version of bind or whatever. But instead, it will be other types of problems that we will have to deal with. So on the positive side, there's a lot of improvements, and possibly we can even sort of shift focus from, let's call it name server configuration, to actual zone content, and we could start getting our zones in shape and fix some of the brokenness we have there, because there is a lot actually. So we haven't run this service for a very long time in the enterprise sector, but let me tell you that we're already seeing broken zones. The broken zones are out there, and many of the broken zones, they are sort of a reflection of people actually running old name server software that doesn't do sufficient verification of the zone content to ensure that it's a correct zone. And that's a good thing, obviously, that if those bad zones are being pushed into a DNS service provider that does verification, and the service provider says, no, 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 that's broken, you're sort of forcing the customer to fix that. And that's a good thing because it will improve overall quality. So that's obviously an improvement, assuming, of course, that the customer relationship survives this interaction when the provider says your zone is broken and the customer says, no. I'm not sure that will always work out, but in the long run, we will improve the quality of the DNS namespace where stuff actually works better. So that's good. But there are also certain disadvantages, and the disadvantages here are that we will have a smaller space of providers because the smaller regional players will be edged out. We will have a sort of unnecessary system cost carrying all sorts of data around the planet, where the DNS data from mom, pop, and the dog zones are moved all over in spite of the queries. That is, those 3 queries per week that data actually gets are all coming from the same minor city in Sweden. So it's sort of unnecessary to have the data available in Singapore and all sorts of places. But that's not a problem to the customer, that's a problem for the provider. And we're really changing the problem statement here from name server maintenance and name server configuration into API specifications and how to integrate various APIs into your business. So that will require, well, new skill set. It will require, to some extent, new people, and it will probably decrease over time the amount of, let's call it DNS, standard DNS consulting configuration work, etc., because that will be a smaller, it will be a large-scale operation, but it's at a smaller number of places. Are we running a risk of a monoculture? I really don't think so. It's not a question of one provider taking it all. It's a question of a whole bunch of providers, but it's still a much smaller number than what we're seeing today, when there are hundreds of thousands of name servers being run more or less independently of each other. But on the other hand, a concern is that the more we move away from, let's call it a standard DNS, as God meant it to be, definition of DNS, into more and more proprietary components, be it APIs, be it behavior modifying stuff, policy-based responses, all of this that is not standard DNS. It's edging towards the closed source environment. And that, I think, is a concern that we should at least be aware of. So to wrap this up, this is a slide from a year ago with some predictions, and I think it's completely wrong. I've changed my mind on a couple of things here. So here's the updated version. And I think there that sure, DNS service and routing is sort of becoming more and more mixed through any cost, but the customer actually doesn't care about that. It's not their problem, it's the provider's problem. When it comes to the smaller providers, I thought they would be edged out. I actually think they will die, to be honest. I don't think we will have small-scale DNS providers who are trying to make a living from this or trying to make some money from this in 5 years. That market will just disappear. And the closed source stuff, I spoke about that. And the DNS consulting thing, well, I've been working professionally with DNS for 25 years. So I sort of know a bit about the DNS consulting stuff, and I actually do that on occasion separate from Netnod. And it's sort of a good thing, because people really depend on these DNS consultants that fix things for them, because they have an inability of fixing it themselves, and they always get into trouble making things more and more complicated. But some of that will certainly remain, especially on the inside of the corporate border. But on the outside, all the public stuff, that will probably just disappear. You will just sort of connect your pipe to an API somewhere with a provider and throw all the zones over the fence, and then you're done. So I hope that means that you will get some more free time on your hands, and you will use that time to actually look at your DNS contents and sort of improve quality there. But there's no sign of that actually happening. Okay, so that's more or less it. Obviously, as you know, we are providing this enterprise service since some time back, and we happen to believe that we are in the best in the business and all that stuff. So if you're interested, come and talk to us and come and talk to our resellers. Questions? Do you think I'm right? Someone thinks I'm right. Do you think there are concerns here that are valid? Yes, Benno.
Hi, Benno Overeender. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. And one of your remarks, I'm not sure it's a real concern, but one of your remarks indeed that DNS is not a function anymore. Depending on the place where you ask a question, you get different answers, either by policy, filtering, views, etc. And for a long time, and Netnod was strict, more strict than many others.
You were part of the purists,
yeah.
as am I. So
no.
yeah.
And even with DNS reactions, they created a very nice animated GIF with a cat. Swiping everything away.
Yeah.
We don't do that, we don't do this. But in talking with the industry, we get repeated questions for, we want to have something like views, and actually they didn't like views either. But with with mergers, for some period they have to deal with two views of two companies.
Yep.
And of course, in the end, they want to have one single view. And so we moved also with them, actually. So going from a very strict perspective, talking with industry and talking with users, we also moved to a more, less strict view or less of the DNS and implemented this kind of features. I don't know, it's a question to you or to the community. Is it good or bad, or how do we think? Because the thing we always had in the back of our mind is we don't want to have DNS being used or abused as kind of for censorship. And so whatever you build, you can also use these kind of, like RZP, response zone policy, you can also use to block sites for good reasons, but also for political reasons.
Yeah,
and I find it very, not a difficult, but a good discussion worth. And some time to think about it, what are the consequences you do as an open source developer for the good of the community?
Yeah, I think you and I are in exactly the same boat here. We would like to preserve the purity of DNS, but yeah, there's no denying that this particular feature that someone asks for, well, they have justification for asking for it because there is a perceived problem they want to solve, and in the end the market always wins. Yeah. So I think we are in agreement here. But at the same time, it's not only a question of whether functionality and features would be misused or political versus actual practical problems, etc. There are other concerns. I mean, if you look at DNS, not making this into a long rant, just making it into a short rant, DNS is basically just a rendezvous mechanism. It's a mechanism to allow two parties to find each other, right? I can publish this point of contact, and you can find the point of contact and get to my web server, send me email or whatever. And what makes the internet great, okay, the rant is slightly longer, is that this is a global namespace for everyone, and it sort of only works if it's a single namespace. And we have all sorts of statements over the years from various parties about the importance of the single namespace, and that is being eroded.
No. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. No more questions? Thank you.